French and Indian War / 7 Years' War, 1754 to 1763. Part 2. American-style historical narration script. Detailed, historically grounded. If the 13 colonies became a society by 1754, the next question is simple. Who would control the continent? Because in the mid-18th century, North America was not the United States. It was a contested world. British colonies along the Atlantic coast, French power stretching through the St. Lawrence and the Great Lakes, and native nations whose homelands and alliances shaped everything in between. The conflict that followed is called the French and Indian War in British America. In Europe and across the globe, it becomes part of a larger storm known as the 7 Years' War. But no matter what name you use, the meaning is the same. This war decides the balance of power in North America, and it leaves Britain with an empire so expensive to run that it triggers a chain reaction leading straight toward revolution. The real start: land, rivers, and the Ohio Valley. The spark ignites in the Ohio Valley, roughly the region where modern Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia meet. To the British colonists, the Ohio Valley looked like opportunity: land, timber, and a gateway to the interior. To the French, it was the connective corridor linking Canada to Louisiana, held together by rivers and forts. To native nations, it was home, and also strategic ground, where alliances could preserve autonomy or invite disaster. In the early 1750s, France moves to tighten control over the region. French officers and soldiers build or strengthen a chain of forts, aiming to block British expansion and secure the river routes. British colonial leaders, especially in Virginia, see this as a direct threat. Virginia's governor sends a young militia officer, George Washington, into the interior with a warning to the French to withdraw. Washington's mission does not end the crisis, it exposes it. 1754. Jumonville Glen and Fort Necessity. In 1754, Washington returns to the Ohio region with a small force. Events unfold fast, and the details are debated in history, but the outcome is clear. Violence breaks out. At a place later known as Jumonville Glen, Washington's men, along with native allies, clash with a small French party led by Joseph Coulon de Jumonville. Jumonville is killed. The French treat the episode not as a simple skirmish, but as an attack that demands retaliation. Washington withdraws and hastily builds a defensive position called Fort Necessity. It is not a strong fort. It is a rough stockade in a vulnerable location. French forces counterattack. Washington is surrounded, outmatched, and forced to surrender in July 1754. This matters for 2 reasons. First, it proves the Ohio Valley will not be decided by diplomacy alone. Second, it signals that a local struggle can ignite an imperial war. Albany Congress. Colonial unity. Almost. In the same year, colonial leaders meet at the Albany Congress, hoping to coordinate defense and manage relations with the Iroquois Confederacy. Benjamin Franklin proposes a plan for colonial union, the Albany Plan of Union. It is ahead of its time. Colonial assemblies fear losing local power. British officials fear a unified colonial government might become too independent. The plan fails. But the idea, colonies acting together, has been spoken out loud. And once that idea exists, it doesn't disappear. 1755. British offensive and Braddock's disaster. In 1755, Britain decides to escalate.
One major goal is Fort Duquesne, a key French position near the forks of the Ohio, today's Pittsburgh. British General Edward Braddock leads a large force westward. It is a difficult march through forests, rivers, and narrow paths. French troops and native allies know the terrain. They strike Braddock's column in an ambush-like battle near the Monongahela. The result is a shocking British defeat. Braddock is mortally wounded. The British retreat in chaos. George Washington, serving as an aide, survives, an experience that stays with him. Braddock's defeat exposes the weakness of traditional European-style warfare in the North American interior. In forests and frontier conditions, mobility, scouting, and native alliances often matter more than rigid formations. That same year, Britain also moves against French power in other areas, with mixed results.
In 1755, British authorities begin the deportation of Acadians from Nova Scotia, French-speaking communities caught in the struggle for control of the region. This removal, often called the Great Expulsion, becomes one of the war's most painful human stories, scattering families across the Atlantic world. 1756. The war goes global. 7 Years' War. By 1756, conflict expands beyond North America. Britain and France fight not just for a valley, but for global dominance, trade routes, sugar islands, and influence in India. In Europe, major powers align in shifting coalitions. Prussia and Britain become linked, while France and Austria draw together, turning the war into a worldwide contest. In North America, the French begin the war with significant advantages. They have strong positions along the St. Lawrence and Great Lakes. They maintain deep relationships with several native nations through trade and diplomacy, and their strategic goal is clear: contain British expansion along the coast and protect the interior network that links Canada to Louisiana. The British, meanwhile, have larger colonial populations and greater economic capacity, but they face serious problems. Colonial governments argue over funding and authority. Militias vary in reliability, and frontier settlers are vulnerable to raids and retaliations as the war escalates. 1757. Fort William Henry and the Fear of the Frontier. In 1757, a major episode unfolds at Fort William Henry near Lake George. French forces, under the Marquis de Montcalm, besiege the fort. The British garrison surrenders. What follows becomes infamous. As the defeated British withdraw, violence breaks out, involving some native allies of the French. Reports of killings spread rapidly, fueling fear and propaganda in British America. The episode is remembered not just for what happened on the ground, but for how it shaped colonial perceptions, turning the war into a struggle for survival in the public imagination. 1758. The Turning Point. Pitt's Strategy and British Momentum. If you're looking for a shift in the war, 1758 is a turning point. William Pitt, often called Pitt the Elder, becomes the driving force of British war policy. Pitt understands that Britain's strength is naval power and financial capacity. He pours resources into the war. He funds colonial efforts. He prioritizes key targets. And he treats the American theater as central, not secondary. British campaigns in 1758 begin to break the French position. One of the biggest victories is the capture of Louisbourg, the French fortress guarding the entrance to the St. Lawrence River. With Louisbourg taken, the route into the heart of New France opens. Britain also captures Fort Frontenac on Lake Ontario, disrupting French supply lines.
At the same time, other British offensives faced setbacks, most famously the failed assault on Fort Carillon, Ticonderoga, where French defenses and terrain help inflict heavy British losses.
And then comes Fort Duquesne. In 1758, the Forbes expedition pushes toward it with a different approach, building roads, securing supply, and advancing more carefully. French forces, under growing pressure and facing weakened support, abandon and destroy Fort Duquesne. The British take the site and rename it Pittsburgh, honoring William Pitt. The Ohio Valley, the spark of the war, begins to tilt toward Britain. 1759, the year of victories, Quebec and the Plains of Abraham. In 1759, British momentum peaks. This year becomes known in Britain as the Year of Victories. The most famous event is the campaign against Quebec, the capital of New France. Quebec sits high above the St. Lawrence River, protected by cliffs and fortifications. Taking it is not easy. British forces under General James Wolfe attempt to break the French defense commanded by Montcalm. After months of pressure, Wolfe's army executes a daring move, landing troops and climbing to the Plains of Abraham outside the city. A major battle follows. The British win. Both commanders, Wolfe and Montcalm, die from wounds connected to the fighting, and their deaths become part of the war's legend. But the strategic consequence is larger than legend. Quebec falls, and the backbone of French power in Canada is fractured. In the same year, Britain wins key victories elsewhere, including in the Caribbean, where sugar islands represent enormous wealth. Global war means global prizes. 1760, the fall of Montreal and the end of New France. Even after Quebec, the war in Canada is not over. But by 1760, the situation is grim for France and North America. British forces converge on Montreal, and French resistance collapses. Montreal surrenders. With Montreal's fall, New France as a political entity effectively ends. France no longer has a realistic path to hold Canada in the face of British power and colonial population. Yet the wider war continues. Across oceans, empires still fight. 1762. The war spreads. India, the Caribbean, and new enemies. By this stage, the 7 Years' War truly looks global. In India, British and French forces and their local allies struggle for influence. British victories, including the consolidation of power after battles like Plassey, 1757, and later campaigns, help expand British influence in South Asia. In the Caribbean, Britain targets French sugar colonies. In 1762, Spain enters the war on France's side. Britain responds by striking Spanish possessions, capturing Havana in Cuba and Manila in the Philippines. Massive blows that demonstrate how far Britain's reach extends. These late war campaigns matter because they shape the peace settlement. When diplomats finally negotiate, they are bargaining with a global map of captured territory, not just North America. 1763. Treaty of Paris, a continent reassigned. The war ends with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. The terms reshape North America. France cedes Canada and its claims east of the Mississippi River to Britain, except for small fishing rights and islands in certain areas. Spain cedes Florida to Britain. France's territory west of the Mississippi, Louisiana, has already been transferred to Spain in a separate agreement, formalized around this period, partly to compensate Spain for losses, and to keep territory out of British hands. Britain, in turn, returns certain captured colonies and possessions, trading some conquests back in exchange for strategic gains. On paper, Britain emerges as the dominant power in eastern North America. But dominance comes with a price. The native reality, the war after the war. For many native nations, the end of French power is not a victory, it is a warning. France had often acted as a counterweight to British colonial expansion. With France removed from Canada, British settlers now see fewer barriers to moving west. Native leaders understand what that means: more encroachment, more pressure, more conflict. In 1763, a major native resistance movement, often associated with Pontiac and other leaders, erupts in the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley region. It is a reminder that treaties between European powers do not automatically control the continent. People living there still fight for their land. In response to rising frontier violence and imperial anxiety, Britain issues the Proclamation of 1763, attempting to limit settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. The goal is partly to reduce conflict and manage empire. But many colonists see it as an insult, an attempt to block them from land they believe they earned through war. The debt that builds a revolution. Now we get to the consequence that matters most for what comes next. Britain wins the war, but at enormous cost. The empire has gained territory, but it has also gained responsibilities: troops, forts, diplomacy, and administration across a vastly expanded frontier. Britain is deep in debt. British officials believe the colonies should help pay for their own defense. That idea, reasonable to London, sounds threatening in America. Because by 1763, the colonists have a long memory of local control. They have assemblies. They have habits of self-government. They have learned to argue over taxation and authority. So when Britain begins tightening trade enforcement and considering new taxes, it collides with a colonial society that is already used to managing its own affairs. In other words, the French and Indian War doesn't just redraw the map. It changes the relationship between Britain and the colonies. It removes the French threat that once made colonists depend on British protection. It makes Britain stronger and more demanding. It pushes colonists west into conflict. It builds imperial debt into policy. And it sets the stage for the next chapter: the road to revolution. Because after 1763, the question is no longer, can Britain defeat France? The question becomes, can Britain control the empire it just won?